I always knew there would be a day where I'd be making this video. I just didn't know when it would be or how I'd handle it. But for a very long time, I have wanted to do a, not analysis, not review, not really a discussion per se, but a personal breakdown, for me, the entire spin-off franchise of Shin Megami Tensei known as Persona. A franchise that I've known the entirety of my life, have put several thousands of hours into across all technically 7 games if you count If and the other half of 2, and something that I have just always wanted to tackle, to talk about what works for the series, what hasn't, where I feel it stands, and where it goes from here. The main reason being is that this franchise has had one of the most complicated relationships with me of any franchise I've known. And what I mean by this is that I love this series, but I also fucking hate it in the simplest way possible. So join me as I sit down for this podcast like retrospective, as I talk about every single Persona entry, what I think of them, why I stand by them, what I like, what I don't like, not just to do with the games but the community surrounding them, and where I fear the future of this series will go. Firstly, yes, I will acknowledge Shin Megami Tensei If. Although I personally have never played the game, I did go out of my way to watch some footage on it, so I could at least include it in the conversation because it is a part of the shared universe of Persona, and characters from SMT If find their way in the original Revelations Persona, so I feel like I needed to address it to some extent. Ultimately, it's not my cup of tea because of how dated it is, unfortunately, and like there are a lot of dated things I will always go out of my way to try out and give enjoyment. Like I enjoyed all the classic Castlevanias despite never playing them when I was a kid, when I went through them last year. I enjoyed going through the original 8-bit Final Fantasy when my introductory game was 4. Things like that, I always try to. But old school borderline point and click adventures, I just struggled to maintain interest in. So from although I've seen it, I was like, okay, yeah, it's interesting. The idea of it basically being the original Shin Megami Tensei, what if things were different? And that what if things were different is what eventually leads into the path of the original Persona. So I felt like I needed to at least acknowledge its existence before beginning, even if I personally don't have much experience with it. Although I won't be able to put on this review, so I want it to be more of just a podcast thing and more of just a relaxed scenario, the music is great. You can hear how dated it is, but listen to Akira Battle Volume or something like that when you get the chance. It's been remixed so many times throughout the Atlas Megaton franchise because of how great a track it is, and I think it's a testament to how good the whole soundtrack really is, despite some of the sound chips they use giving away its age far greater than some other games. It does an amazing job with what it has, and I commend the effort. But starting with the game that actually was the first experience I had to Persona, the original Revelations Persona on PS1. Yeah, that one, where they changed the skin colour of one of the characters for the sake of it, changed the hair colour of the protagonist to try and make it look more westernised, and did a extremely questionable job translating it all because the Western team of Atlas was like one person big at the time. But the game, as much as I enjoy it and I'll always have a bias of nostalgia towards it, doesn't change the fact that it is by default the most dated game in the series and the hardest to approach, especially retrospectively. I'll get to more of what I mean when I get to Persona 2, but Persona 1 is not an easy game to go back to, even if you've played it before. Even if you've got experience with it and enjoy it, you go back to it now, its cracks are blindingly apparent because it came out before a lot of other JRPGs in the late 90s and early 2000s kind of reinvented the board of how JRPGs should be. And because of that, you are getting that sort of old school Final Fantasy, but different with more cracks. Where the older Final Fantasies, there was always this tendency of, if you've played the later ones, you can see the problems in the older ones, because 7 and 9 reinvented the board so much and paved the path of where the games should all go, that getting to the previous ones, when you eventually go back to them, becomes jarring. Persona 1 has that, but tenfold, because it wasn't Final Fantasy, basically. Even with Final Fantasy's datedness, there was still a degree of quality in the older games. The original Persona does not have that. The story has a lot of jumps in logic that even if you base it off the original Japanese, or as much as I don't like it, play the PSP remake, will still won't make much sense even when translated properly. There are some threats with it, especially with the main girl, whose name slips my mind because this is unscripted, so forgive me, and her 3 demons, and having to hunt them down and get through that. And then that side story with that man, it's just... Persona 1 is one of those things where I always want people to try it, but at the same time I never want people to try it, because I want them to try it to see what the humble beginnings of this series and how different it was. Because Persona was before social links, it was before you could really do much with compendiums and fusions, it was before like you had timers and day cycles and things like that. If you played original Shin Megami Tensei's, Persona worked like that, where every so many steps you took, the moon just changed its cycle, and that was it. And depending on where the moon was in its cycle, dictated where you stood. It dictated how the demons or the personas would react and how things would be. There were also a few things that they kind of retconned out in the later games, like Nadia Photep being a persona, and it's like, oof, he's like the main villain of it too. But Persona 1 is a humble but extremely dated game. I think the biggest thing that saves it, in my opinion, is the Snow Queen quest. Because the Snow Queen quest, despite the dates in the mechanics, because it was before the One More system was introduced in Persona 3. You're going to get a lot of that. Persona 1 and 2 have a lot of things. It was like, things were different because they had to, because it was before they reinvented the wheel with 3. And don't worry, that doesn't mean 3's some kind of saint, but I'll get to that later, and I can imagine that'll piss a lot of people off when I talk about Persona 3, and I hope not, because I do have a lot of good to say about that game, but I just have a lot of bad that I think needs to be aired out, because people just let it get away with murder sometimes. But anyway, but Persona 1 does have this charm with it, even despite its age, and despite its systems, and if you can appreciate it for that and get past it, it is fun to go through, and there is fun to be had. The dungeons suck. I'm going to warn you now. The dungeons are very samey. And it's a criticism that stands with most of this franchise. But a lot of the dungeons, their aesthetic is different, but their structure of getting through them doesn't change. And in Persona 1, with the fact that if you played the Persona Q games, which I only briefly talk about during this because I don't really like them, but if you played the Q games, you'll be familiar with it. It's more of an Entry and Odyssey styled first-person exploration game when you're in dungeons, which is fine, but this is before things like Entry and Odyssey, because we're talking like 96, I think, it came out. And so this game instead just has corridors after corridors after corridors, and then we'll have a door at the end that's randomly locked, and then 6 doors back is magically opened because you interact with said locked door. And then once you finally go through this cycle for about an hour straight, they will throw a random boss fight at you that ranges between pathetically easy but has way too much health, or insanely hard but dies in one hit. So it's just a matter of who hits who first. Or the final boss, Pandora, which is just somehow both. It's not a difficult fight, but your casts just keep randomly dying and the fight goes on forever. But it's something that you have to take with a grain of salt, but if you've ever been interested in the origins of Persona, you should try and give it a go. I personally will always say try and get a hold of the PlayStation 1 original, because it has by far the better soundtrack, because it plays into the more atmospheric story it has of how demons can manipulate the mind and dreams of the butterflies. It has a very atmospheric feeling about how it presents its story and characters, even if it's extremely kooky in the translation in the original PS1. But the PSP remake completely replaced that soundtrack to be something more representative of later games in the series, which makes sense on a series perspective, doesn't make sense for the more atmospheric and serious story that the original game was trying to tell, and it really fucking hurts it. It has some good tracks, and I'm not going to take it away from that, but it is so unfitting to the original that it actually tainted the experience when I went through the PSP version, and it's one of the biggest reasons why I say avoid it like the plague. I also say avoid it because it got rid of the Snow Queen quest, which, like I said, is my favourite thing. Despite being entirely optional, it has 3 optional dungeons which are the most fun dungeons in the game, and a really cool extra boss at the end that's just really fun to do. And the fact that it's entirely optional just makes it more inviting. It makes it more exciting. Like, I remember being super little, and well, to be honest, when I was a kid, I was the only kid I knew who played Persona. Everyone was on the Final Fantasy train, which, to be fair, I was too. But I played both because I just wanted more JRPGs. I was just in that camp as a kid, and still am to an extent. I've kind of grown more into it as I've got older and started to get a bit more tired and just a bit slower on my reflexes as I'm getting older. But before I completely lose train of thought, the Snow Queen quest was something that I always liked talking about in the original Persona. I don't want to spoil it because I can bet anyone listening to this hasn't played Persona 1, and as much as I really recommend hunting down the original, good luck doing that. If you have a PlayStation Classic, you know, that little mini box, it does come with the original Revelations Persona, and it is dirt cheap. But even then, I'd struggle to justify to you buying a PlayStation Mini or Classic or whatever you want to call it solely for one game, because it doesn't really have much else on there, oddly enough. Like, it had a lot of opportunity to just go insane with it, and for some reason Sony just decided to make it a basic little box that just has a few little things here and there and not much else. But if you really don't want to do that, which is fair enough, then I suppose, yes, play the original. But if you don't like the music, please don't hold it against the original game, because it wasn't there in the original game. My biggest grievance, and it's the one I always bring up, is the final boss theme. The original final boss theme is around 6 minutes long. Let's look it up. Revelations Persona Pandora theme. And it's around 6 minutes long, and it's a very brooding, atmospheric track that has a lot of power into it that only starts to pick up near the end. Something that I always want to feel was sort of referenced with a track in Persona 4, but one thing at a time. I'm still talking about Persona 1 and we're 12 minutes in. But in the PSP remake, they replaced it with not only generic rock, but generic rock that loops after about 45 seconds. And it dismantled the entire intimidation factor that Pandora had, because Pandora is one of the most disgusting looking bosses in the franchise. And I say that knowing what almost all the bosses in the Midnight Hour had in Persona 3. But Persona 1's final boss, Pandora, is just revolting to look at. When you see all the arms, you see the blob, you see the face in the middle of its chest, and you see the weird thing it has for a head, and then you see it literally split open like a cocoon to reveal a butterfly at the end. It's something that when you experience it, especially as a kid, it fucking sticks with you. That thing is a freak of nature, and it's genuinely the most disgusting looking thing in Persona. But fighting it is where I get to talk about how they changed, how different the gameplay was in the original Persona. In the original Persona, they didn't have any kind of extra turn extension systems. They didn't have once more like Persona 3. They didn't have press turns like mainline SMT did after Nocturne. They didn't have any of that. Instead, they made it a grid system, where before battle, or during battle, but you'd spend a turn, you could bring up a grid and it would show a big grid arena of where every enemy stood and where every character stood. And you could move those characters around the grid. The further away from the enemy, the less physical damage their attacks would do, but their persona damage would be fine. On the flip side being, they would take less for being further away from the enemy, but magic would be the same. It became a trade-off of how close to the enemy's grid do you want to start with, and how close do you want to start to the back wall to balance it out. This system worked, but the problem with it is Persona and Magic is so powerful franchise-wide that it felt like you shouldn't bother with physical, or you'd go all in on physical. So you'd either have everyone right at the back wall and maybe only one person out front just use a bit tankier just so the enemy's more likely to target them, or you'd have everyone on the front line and just power damage them, like power rush them. And so because of that, you didn't really see people experiment that much because it felt pointless to. Because there was just too much of a power struggle with how magic works in Persona, especially in the earlier games, that the only thing you felt like you needed to adjust your strategy to was status conditions. If you wanted someone, if someone you knew was going to be vulnerable to status conditions, like you say you had a dedicated mage, you'd have them further back to avoid them getting silenced. And things like that. but that's about it. But because so strategy felt very limiting, and it's something that, as much as I love the next game I'm going to talk about, it does share that problem. But that being said, to continue this podcast, let's move on to Persona 2 Innocent Sin. This game is the epitome of learning from the first. Something I love about games that have trouble with them is if they still manage to get a sequel anyway, on the off chance that that sequel ends up becoming everything I hoped it could be and everything I hoped it could learn from the original. To give some modern examples, Evil Within, Death End Request. Evil Within had so many flaws and problems, and Death End Request 1 had so many flaws and problems, but both games got sequels which I think perfected it, ironed out all their problems, and became really fantastic games that I really enjoy because of it. But Persona 2 did do that for Persona 1. More specifically, Innocent Sin did. And I can only talk from the PSP version because, rather infamously, despite being the canonical version of Persona 2, it was never released to the West until the PSP remake, whilst Eternal Punishment, the non-canonical version, was on the PS1, but then wasn't on the PSP. So yeah, it's a minefield what happened there, and the fact that they haven't done any kind of release of the two together ever since, it's just idiotic. It doesn't make any sense why they haven't bundled the two together in any form or fashion in the West yet. I know that Atlas just don't give a shit about the classic Persona anymore because everything's about 3, 4, and 5, but it's still kind of baffling that they haven't done this. But that being said, starting off with the criticisms, yes, it still does have the grid system. To try and balance it out a little bit more, they lean more into the fusions and start adding more of the fusion variety with the different arcanas that you're more familiar with if you've played Persona 3, 4, and 5. Arcanas did exist in the first one, but they were far more simplified, and so getting the demon you wanted felt more like chances in a hat, like picking a name out of a hat. Like you didn't feel like you got it as easily as you feel like it should have been. Whilst in 2, although it wasn't as clean as 3 makes it, it still had problems, and it was still a bit dated and rough around the edges, but there was a huge step of improvement. What makes Persona 2 so fucking fantastic though, and it's something that Persona 3 shares with it, is that despite its gameplay flaws, its story and its characters are fantastic. Persona 2 introduces the idea of having each Persona game revolve around a theme, and Persona 2 is that it uses rumours, and how destructive a small rumour can ultimately become if heard by the right people and used in the right ways. And despite being a very simple and kind of underutilized premise, because of the involvements of the shadows and how they affect everything, and Narliofotep making a bet with Philemon, rumours, if they gain enough publicity, become real, even if they never were. And so the game becomes a struggle of information checking and trying to keep things that you shouldn't be able to hear at bay. Like about partway through the game, these organisations spread the rumour that they have planted bombs that are destined to go off. Stopping them is about being in those locations before the rumours can take effect, to stop anyone from believing it in those areas. Failure to do so, you just hear an explosion and 3 buildings collapse. And you just have to suffer the consequences of those deaths because you failed to step in and get involved enough to solve the problem. And it's even quite alarming how they handle it too, because it doesn't tell you when you've run out of time straight away. It doesn't tell you at all. It waits until you approach one of those buildings and it just fucking blows up in your face. And it startled me as a kid because I didn't know about that side story going on. You only learn about it by going out of your way to talk to people and spending your time around the town, and you learn about what's starting to spread and what's going around, and then you have to intervene. But if you don't know about it, you'll fail it without ever realizing it existed, and so you just approach a building and just see you go boom. But that is more the humorous side of it in that sense. Like, everyone wants to talk about, and I know if you're watching this and talking about it, you're like, oh, is he going to bring up Hitler? Yeah, Hitler's in this for the similar reason. Through the rumour sphere, they talk about how Hitler may have survived, and so he gets willed into existence, and the entire Nazi army does too, with the symbols and everything. Something that was censored to a very minimal ability in the Western version by giving him sunnies and changing the symbol to the Iron Cross instead, and which I just I appreciate the effort, but okay. But that, I always feel like, pulls away from the haha it's a funny game with Hitler for how serious and effective and fascinating the story is. A lot of it revolves around Maya and the kids that she met younger in life. Your whole main cast of characters are all a band of kids who knew each other when they were little, but separated because of an event that you all don't remember, and now reunited now in high school in your final year. And it's just, you've all happened to reunite, and then you get pulled into the world of Persona. Maya is the only exception, being like a year or two older than the rest of your cast, who joins a little later on, and seems to have some history with you all, and is wary of fire. And I'm gonna spoil this now, because it is something that if you haven't played it yourself, I'm not gonna do it service just how amazing and well handled this twist is. Throughout the game, you meet Jester, who's ultimately revealed to be one of those kids, and the only one who went out of his way to make sure he remembered anything, because he had a very tactile mind. So despite being a kid witnessing a traumatic event, he remained a memory of it because he had such a mind to do so. When Jester is broken down to reveal June, and you get the truth out of him, he still hides pieces of the puzzle of what's going on until Maya runs away, and when you find her and confront her, she reveals what happened. When they were all kids, they all played together, and they all played together in this wooden house, would often play tag or hide and seek or things like that. One day, as a prank, they locked Maya in the wooden shack, which was all going to be haha, all fun and all dandy. They couldn't work out how to unlock it again afterwards, after they'd had their fun for 30 odd seconds or so, and the wooden shack happened to catch fire. Maya was burnt really badly and severely damaged, and you can see the evidence of it the very moment you see her, because she is extremely pale. And she wears long sleeves, and she's one of the only characters that does so. She hides all of her marks on her body. She wears long sleeves, long trousers, big boots. Like, she has her shirt buttoned up, and she has an extremely pale face. Like, she hides her damage, but she was badly damaged by that fire. And the kids, all rightly so, took responsibility for it, because they scarred her for life, both physically and mentally. She never mentally recovered for it, and it's why she's absolutely terrified of anything to do with fire. And knowing that, it sends all the kids on this guilt trip spiral of self-hate and neglect, and even, like, oh, I gotta talk about Lisa, but I'll get to her in a second, and how each of the kids react, and you having to go out of your way as Tatsuya, the protagonist, to try and find them and find reason with them and talk them down and learn more about them, and sometimes confronting their shadows, which, if you're not familiar with them, shadows are essentially the dark part of your heart that you hide away. It's something that is present in every single Persona game, technically. I say technically because Persona 3 the answer, we'll fucking get to that. But it exists in every game, and the shadow is just a dark part of your heart that you hide from yourself, and if it becomes a natural being, they have a habit of revealing that to you. The shadows that the characters face, like, one of them, like, Ichiki has this neglect and failure to live up to his dad, and he feels like he's not doing enough for his family, and that he's a letdown, and that he's a disappointment that shouldn't have been born, things like that, and you have to try and pull him out of it. But the one that has always stuck out with me, something that has always stayed with me, is Lisa's. Lisa, you find out through her shadow that when she was a child, she was sold for sex quite often. Which, if you've played the later Persona games, you might sit there and go, what the fuck? If you played 4 and 5, because 4 and 5 get dark at points, but they don't get as dark as what they do with Lisa. She was sold for sex as a kid, and when she grew up, because of it, to deal with the trauma and the pain, she took on hard drugs, and she's a drug addict. When she was with your party, you'll notice that early on in the game, she's really, like, flamboyant and carefree. But as the game goes on, she becomes slightly more skittish, and she becomes more weary and more out of it and just out of place. It's because the whole time she's with your party, she's being watched, so she can't get her fix, and so she's on the down of it, and it's breaking her. and you have to kind of get her to confront her past very directly of what happened, despite the fact she knows she'll never get justice for what was done to her. And that shit, when I first played through it at the tender age of like 8, I didn't understand it. But when I came back to it as I was older and went through it, it hits me like a truck. And it's why I always say Persona 2 is darker than 3. A lot of people sit and go, no, 3's dark as shit. And I go, yeah, it is. 3 has this really good theming of death and how it handles it and how to move forward from it. But Persona 2 has rape victims. And you have to teach them and you have to help them learn that sometimes you just won't get justice for it. And that fucks you up. I'm telling you now. Like, it gets to me even thinking about it. Like, Lisa's story arc really fucks you up when you first experience it. Because you sit there and you go, holy shit. Like, it weighs on you and it sits with you. And you have to try and help her confront it. And what doesn't help is that throughout the game, a lot of the cast, because like Anne from Persona 5, she's from the US and her family moved to Japan. Lisa is a hard name to pronounce in Japan, so they call her Ginkgo instead. Ginkgo's an insult. You've been insulting the poor girl throughout most of the game, and afterwards they all kind of go, ooh. And the thing is that when, I think it was in the PSP remake, but the memory's starting to rough down on me because I marathoned through the whole series before I made this video. But Innocent Sin was a while ago still, when you think about all the rest of the series I played afterwards. But I think you can set what her nickname is, and I set it back to Lisa. It was either that or Eternal Punishment that let you do it, and I just set it back to Lisa, because once you know her story, it's like, no, you don't want to call her an insult, you want to call her by her name. Anyone can just learn to deal with it. And stuff like that sticks with you, and then you get to the ending, and the ending is old school Atlas. And old school Atlas, I will make a point of mentioning again when I get to Persona 3 Base, before I talk about Fez and Portable and everything that came after. But old school Atlas really had a good ability to commit to horrible situations. The ending of Persona 2 Original was that you don't win. There is this, and throughout the story, there is this deal and this bet between Philemon and Nyarlathotep. Philemon is why Personas exist. He created them. He is essentially, I don't want to say the father, but like the creator of Igor and the Velvet Room, and lets them rule over. Anytime you see a blue butterfly flying around in the series, that is Philemon watching over you. And he is present in the series throughout. Nyarlathotep is the embodiment of every shadow. He is the crawling chaos, and so he made a bet that humanity would succumb and fall apart under itself without having to do anything. And Philemon said no, humanity will always find a way to strive across any obstacle. Both of them intervened with their own bet, Philemon giving humanity personas to thrive, and Philemon adding shadows to the world to destroy them. Philemon wins. Not Philemon, sorry, Nyarlathotep wins. Philemon's strategy and his brain power and his game gets defeated universally by Nyarlathotep. Humanity starts to break down through the entourage of shadows. Humanity does not have the strength to face their own demons. Humanity would rather hide from their demons until it consumes them. And so, when you fight Nyarlathotep as the final boss, although you win the fight, you lose the argument and you lose the strategy as a whole. And so as a last-ditch effort to undo everything, Philemon resets time and alters fate to make it so none of the cast will ever meet each other. So although that traumatic event when they were kids still happened, they never meet again in high school, and they never re-intervene. Nothing ever happens again. By doing this, all the characters that die, because Maya gets stabbed to death during this, don't have to face that fate. They will get to live, and the world will just become blissfully unaware. The last choice the game gives you is to slap Philemon, and every person under the sun has taken it. You punch that fucker, and you punch him hard, because of how fucked around you have been for the entirety of the game, by him unknowingly. Just because he wanted to see if humanity could thrive, and he wanted to place a bet on it against his brother / enemy, Nyarlathotep, and then Nyarlathotep won anyway. And so the game ends with you all just never seeing each other again, and that being the end of it. Or so it would be if Eternal Punishment didn't exist. Eternal Punishment is a giant what-if game. A very different kind of beast from what you would be expecting, and why it's not canon. Similar to how this franchise came to existence with Shin Megami Tensei If, Eternal Punishment asks what if the cast found a way to bump into each other again anyway. And that's where the story goes. It is based immediately after Innocent Sin, and it's Tatsuya and Maya sort of bumping into each other again, but this time, instead of assuming control of Tatsuya, you assume control of Maya. Gameplay wise, Persona 2 Eternal Punishment is just a slightly more polished version of Innocent Sin, because it came out a year later, and it is what it is. Additionally, although I didn't talk about the soundtrack at all in Innocent Sin, Eternal Punishment does also, I feel, improve on the soundtrack by making it more aggressive, because it's more of a revenge. Once you learn and everyone reunites, they start to remember the original timeline, and so they become more angry and frustrated towards the situation and want to directly intervene with it again, but this time as a round 2 to try and change how things should have been and fight against the argument. Ultimately they don't succeed, but you get to make far more clarity on the subject for the player through it, which is probably the main purpose of the game, because the original ending of Innocent Sin might not be 100% that obvious to you on your first playthrough. Despite how I've explained it to you, it isn't necessarily presented that way. And so I don't have as much to say on Eternal Punishment, because you're basically doing the same game again. However, I do want to say the final dungeon has the best fucking music. Innocent Sin's final dungeon has a track that I find kind of forgettable, and a lot of that is just down to the fact that the dungeon is way too long. While the Mandala Maelstrom, or whatever it's called, at the end of Persona 2 Eternal Punishment has a fantastic track in not just the original game, but in the PSP remake. The PSP remakes of Persona 1 and 2 I used to not like because of some of the things they changed, but nowadays when I go back to them reflectively, are the definitive versions of the game, and give you the ability to listen to both the original and the new soundtracks. And unlike Persona 1's soundtrack, Persona 2's new soundtrack is as effective and as enjoyable as its original, with the sole exception being Innocent Sin's opening theme. I think the original version of Innocent Sin's opening theme conveys the message of the game and what you're about to get into far better than the rock track that we get in Innocent Sin PSP. And the thing is, I can get away with saying that because if you get Persona 2 on PSP, in the gallery you can watch the original opening, so you can see for yourself and make your own judgment on what I think and see if you agree or not. Like, I don't make your decision. But Eternal Punishment actually flips it around, because the game's more aggressive and has this theme of revenge and punishment and how you can't escape the chaos of your heart and how you're always destined to repeat mistakes. The PSP soundtrack goes in hard aggressive, like it's a proper aggressive rock track, and it's so much more convincing and fitting than the once again more atmospheric original theme. Like, it's amazing how they kind of flipped it round, how in the original Innocent Sin the atmosphere is more fitting, yet in Eternal Punishment the aggressive rock is insanely more fitting. I love the aggressive rock opening because it sets the tone so perfectly for how much angrier Eternal Punishment is compared to not just Innocent Sin but any other Persona game. I would love to see a future Persona title have some of the anger that Eternal Punishment is. I'd love to see an angry Persona game again, because it just doesn't happen. But you also get an extra fight where you actually get to fight Philemon himself, and this is before the optional bosses against Velvet Room attendants were really a thing, so it's the closest thing you had, because the fight is pretty tough. Not as tough as certain other super bosses later in the series, but it will certainly give you a run for your money if you're not prepared for it. And it also has a great track, and despite being a completely different track in the PSP version, I like both themes. It works really effectively in what it's trying to do. The rumours are still sort of in play, but they've taken a step back because you already know what's going on behind the scenes if you played the original. They're still there and they're still present. The only thing that hurts Eternal Punishment, and it's not necessarily to do with the game itself, is the background and Atlus's decision of how they released it in the West. Like I said, the original PS1 version, Innocent Sin never left Japan, Eternal Punishment did. So we only got the second half of the story that wasn't canon, so we didn't understand what the characters were all remembering. And although the translation did as good a job as possible to rectify this and alter some of the text to try and give more clarity, it wasn't enough, and it made chunks of Eternal Punishment still quite confusing until the PSP version came out and we got Innocent Sin PSP. Just for, oh wait, us to never get the PSP version of Eternal Punishment in the West. what? Atlas, come on! But this is a much smaller chunk because I don't have that much to say about Eternal Punishment beyond it, because it's just an enhanced version of 1 with more anger management issues. I will like to give credit, though, to the fact that it's the first Persona game to have a female protagonist, and technically the only one. And the reason why I say technically is because of Persona 3 Portable also having a female protagonist as an option, but it not even having any involvement from Atlas per se, instead a different company that just wanted to do a different spin on things. But yeah, because this video is going to go on for a very long time, the last game I'll talk about on this video will be Persona 3, and it's going to make up probably the rest of this time, because I have a lot to say about Persona 3, because I rather infamously don't like it. And that is something that anytime I have explained or talked about with other people has always earned me a raised eyebrow at minimum, because it's the most beloved game in the series, and I completely understand why, and I will happily talk about what it does really well and what I think it does better than any other game in the series. But when it makes mistakes and stumbles over itself, it stumbles harder than almost every other game in the series bar the original. And so that being said, time for me to break out my notebook, because I had to write a lot down for this as I talk about Persona 3, then I'll talk about Fez, then I'll talk about Portable. If Persona 2 was the darkest story in the series, Persona 3 is the most beautiful. I think it's the easiest way to put it. Persona 3, despite my grievances I'll get to, has an amazing, beautifully written story that does an amazing job of maintaining its theme of death and what comes next. What to do after you lose a loved one, what to do when death is coming and you can't avoid it, what to do when the end is coming, how would you approach it, how would you come to accept it, how would you come to fight it. And it carries it throughout the original story of the original Persona 3 so eloquently, so beautifully and so respectfully that it's hard to ignore, and it's why it kind of set the principle and kind of became the soft reboot of the series that it is, to such an extent that all the games that came before it have barely been acknowledged ever since, rather painfully. And it's not just the main story either, it's present in the social links. You see a kid whose parents are breaking apart and her world is falling apart because of it, and she doesn't know how to do it. You meet a young man who is literally dying and eventually stops taking his medication because he knows it's just prolonging the inevitable, and you encourage him to write a story that, although is very tragic and has a miserable end, he eventually adjusts to make it have a very beautiful end. You know, the alligator that got outcasted because it was a different colour, who then accidentally ate his friend bird, I think it was. But then when he killed himself because he couldn't take it anymore, the tears made the lake that was left incredibly beautiful, where all life thrived afterwards. Like, there's so much beauty and eloquence to the story and how it's delivered that they're the only words I can think to give it. But my issue with it starts to come into play when I get to Fez and Portable, so I have to kind of put that to the side for 1 second. Not all the social links are hits though, and I feel like I need to say this, despite the fact I know this was their first effort. This was the game to introduce social links, and social links have this amazing benefit of being able to directly involve into your gameplay, and being a good pace breaker from the actual dungeon crawling. So being able to talk with people, get to know them, help them through their triumphs and tribulations, and through all of their darkest times, like trying to stop a dude from pretty much stopping himself from walking just so he can make his brother proud. Like, it's so much stuff like that that keep pulling you along as you go through it. But then there are some really shit ones, and the main ones that stand out are the ones where egotistical characters, the only way for you to get brownie points to get their social link to go further is to buddy up to them, is to give them what they want. And it's like, no, like, I can't remember his name, but you all know what I mean if I say the chubby kid. Like, you got him where he never learns his lesson throughout the whole thing. You buddy up to him, he's an absolute arse who tries to con you out of like 100,000 yen, and then what do you do at the end of the game? You're expected to just defend him, when there should have been an option to beat the shit out of him. And it just doesn't do that. But for where it stumbles, they also have some really beautiful ones. I personally have always really enjoyed Fuka as someone who's always had problems with anxiety and self-confidence. Seeing her slowly grow out of her shell and become more confident, it was really enjoyable. Aigis' social link that you get in the last couple months of the game, my god, is what is the best social link in the series. It's such a well-handled, well-written and enjoyable social link that it's baffling that they've never been able to try and replicate it, or never tried to take the risk in replicating it. But then you also have ones like Yukari, where it feels like you just go around in circles a bunch and get nowhere. Oh, but then you end up lovers at the end if you go down that route, whoop-de-doodle. But a lot of the story has a lot of philosophy and psychological points that you get as a player to think on, and it still has one of the most emotional and beautiful endings I have ever experienced in a video game. The way the final week comes together after easily the best final boss in the franchise is something that it gets me emotional thinking about it, because it is just such a powerful source. Like, if you've been a part of the Persona community, you know the joke that if someone is crying listening to music, they're probably listening to the Persona 3 credits song, because of what that song represents and what it means for the story you've just been pulled through, and how magical everything is. Whether it's the acceptance of Shinji and what becomes of him, and how the cast learn to grow from it, and how heartbreaking it is, yet they still find a way to find stride and way forward eventually, even if it takes longer for some than others. Making a very, as much as I don't like Ken, gives Ken a very enjoyable story arc after Shinji's passing, and Akihiko an amazing one, to Chidori and everything that happens with her and how it affects Junpei before and after. But this is where I need to start leaning into Fez, or Fez, for Festival, because Fez is when old Atlas officially passed and new Atlas officially started to come in. New Atlas have this really, really bad habit of failing to commit to the original storyboard. And it's more present in Persona 4 than it is 3. But, oh god. Fez, if you play your cards right, do very specific dialogues, you can pull out this fanfic bullshit to get Chidori back. Chidori will just barely survive through her life essence through a fucking flower or something. And even if you don't go for it, which I never do when I go through Fez, because I just don't think it's right, I just don't think it fits the theme that the original story was going for and the message it was going for, it still completely dismantles any of the impacts and emotional power and the theme that it's tied to, because you know she can possibly survive. And that alone is such a grievance on Fez's story that I have never let go, because it is such a pitiful, destructive thing that Fez also then does to the protagonist through the worst single piece of content in the entire Persona series has ever gotten, which is Persona 3 The Answer. Persona 3 The Answer attempts to answer what happens to Minato, which is what I'll be calling him, after the events of the main adventure. The problem is, at the end of it, it's revealed that he didn't give his life directly to stop Nyx. He gave his life to become a seal, to hold back not only Nyx, but any demons that might be trying to directly involve itself towards the planet. Which is cool and all, but then they drop on you that if humanity could find the strive and the strength to persevere through its own struggles and not let it tear itself apart, to not require things like Nyx to end life, the seal wouldn't be necessary and Minato could come back. And it is, as a kid, I didn't like it, but as I've got older, the more bitter I've become towards it, because I feel like it's a direct attack towards a perfect ending. Making Minato dying and giving his life and having that last week to save the love and have it continue this perfect circle of this theme of death and how to prepare for it and what comes next, to just have something say, oh, but if humanity can get over themselves, he can come back, completely destroys it. And it's something that to this day I've never considered the answer canon, and I've never wanted to, and I am so glad that going into Persona 4 Arena they stopped acknowledging it. Like, they stopped considering it canon as well, because they knew the backlash on it was so severe. And it's something that in turn Portable, which I will give it some slack because it wasn't made by Atlus, it was made by Ghostlight, also did if you play as a female protagonist, because you can save Shinji. And it's just like, for fuck's sake, like, I know it wasn't directly Atlus, but the three biggest and recognizable pinnacles of the theme of death working at its best, all three of them, through extra editions, definitive editions, and PSP remakes, can be undone to an extent. Yes, Shinji is the least offensive because I think he's bedridden for the rest of his life, so he might as well be out of commission in that sense. So it still has some impact, but it's nowhere near as impactful as his death. It's nowhere near as impactful as when Chidori sacrifices herself for Junpei. It's nowhere near as impactful as when the protagonist gives his life. And Fez and Portable just piece by piece take parts of that away. And it's just Atlus getting such cold feet on the subject and not committing after they already released the original Persona 3 that committed. And it's so frustrating that they would do it to such an extent that I don't want them to remake Persona 3, because I think they will make those retcons canon. And I really wouldn't put it past them when you consider Persona 5, which I won't be getting to today because this video is already getting long enough. But now I need to talk about the gameplay. And if you're sitting there going, alright, he said he doesn't like the game, he's probably going to go on about how you only play as one character. Yes, of course I'm fucking going to go on about that, because it's the only game in the franchise that has that problem. 1 and 2 let you control the whole party, every game that came after lets you control the whole party. It wasn't a realistic decision that makes the experience more involving, it was a bad decision that makes the game more frustrating when it's already the most luck-based Persona game in the franchise due to its difficulty. This game is hard for reasons that are out of your control. Even if you use the tactics menu, you don't have any direct control, you just close the bracket of what your AI has a chance of doing. Your teammates will have a habit of using skills that are known to not working again and again and again on some vain hope it will work. Like, I mean, fucking Marin Karen has to exist, doesn't it? Or if you try and have a character heal, unless more than one character is under like a quarter of their life, the healer will only ever heal one person, making it someone else who's only like around the third health, or, you know, still in the danger zone at death's door the very next turn. And the fact that you can't change tactics unless it's your turn, but oh wait, if you're hit with your weakness at any point, too bad, you're missing a whole turn, so you have to wait 2 whole turns with your characters on the tactics that are harmful to what you're potentially harmful to your setup, because you didn't expect the enemy to pull off a one-off random attack that knocks you on your ass. Well, too bad. You have to deal with it of another turn. Whoops, you all died? Ah. Or how about if you hit a weakness but one enemy dodges the attack, you don't get the one more. Because the Persona 3 is what introduced the one more system. If you hit an enemy's weakness or get a critical, it will give that character an extra turn. Which isn't as advanced the press turn as Nocturne, but that's just my bias speaking because I love Nocturne so much. But it's still a very fun and inventive feature, but it had cracks in Persona 3, and those cracks were very prevalent and noticeable. And it's just a hate on the answer again. The answer doesn't even give you a compendium, for fuck's sake, and that's still another 20 hours of wasted time. And it's like, it doesn't even give you a compendium, so if you get a Persona you like, too bad, you have to make it again. And when you have to fuse it off to get something else that you need. But they try their best with the tactics, and I do understand where they were trying to go and what they were trying to do with it. And the field tactics when exploring Tartarus, I do like. I like the idea of that and how you can have your party go off in different directions, even if that in itself, sometimes that AI can be a bit fucky. But it's just how the tactics work in the gameplay, it literally tears itself apart. And yes, I know they fixed it in Portable, but that's not an excuse to suddenly pretend it wasn't a thing and it wasn't a problem. I went hard on Persona 1 for all its problems, despite the PSP version fixing a lot of its hardships, because it still existed there. And what also doesn't help is that Portable gets rid of a lot of small bits and pieces of the content, making for many people Fez still the definitive edition of the game. The one that doesn't let you control your party. I will give it credit though, is that after Persona 3, they stopped letting you equip any weapon to any character. So I do want to give credit to Persona 3, that if you want your character to carry a gun, if you want them to punch enemies, you want them to use a sword, you want them to use an axe, you can. And that was greatly appreciated, because starting with Persona 4, everyone had weapons tied to them, and they had to stick to their class. Which, I get it, yeah, more realistic, but realism should never go against fun. If your realism harms the fun of the game, or harms the enjoyment of the experience, don't have it. And the fact that it's still present in the series now is baffling to me. But Persona 3 does have that. But I need to talk about Tartarus, and Tartarus is both the best effort to get away with the problem that Persona 1's corridors had, and also the worst offender to the dungeons aren't that remarkable problem that the series has. The randomized nature of it is a great idea for its time. You didn't see it that often at that time during that era of the games, especially during the PS2 era, and so having something where every time you went through a floor, you didn't necessarily know what you was going to get, you didn't know what loot you was going to find, you didn't know how it was going to structure itself, made it exciting, and it made it interesting. But as time's gone on, it's lost its spark, and a lot of what made Tartarus fascinating now becomes a giant foray of missed opportunities, because the random flaws stop them from doing anything interesting with it. Something that 4 and 5 both tackle in different ways. 4 more so, because that also has the randomized flaws, but they do more with it, but I'll get to that when I talk about 4 and 5. But on the flip side, boss flaws and specific save flaws and the first floor are all structured the same. They are all scripted flaws, they're not randomized, so they do try and do more things with those flaws alone. And I guess technically the roof, but you know, that's just holding the final boss. But because of its randomized design, there's no gimmicks you can throw in to spice up the dungeon crawling. The only spice up you get is outside the dungeon. But oh wait, you can't grind in there to your heart's content, because people will burn out. Your character's mood will worsen and they will eventually become sick if you burn them through, with their stats lowering slowly but surely to enforce that. And as much as I understand it is to stop you over grinding, the fact that they don't have that in Persona 5, and Persona 5 is still a healthy challenge throughout, kind of proves the point that they didn't have to do that. And if they do decide to remake Persona 3, which I think it's more of a matter of time, I think it's going to happen eventually. I don't think they're going to not, with how much of a buzz it has around it, how much of a buzz Persona 5's got. Persona 3, of their new era Persona games, is the only one to not be milked to shit and beyond, so I think they're gonna, eventually. But when they eventually do, that's the one thing I think they should absolutely change, you know, other than obviously making it so you can control your whole party. And, you know, not retconning deaths. Just don't do that. Don't spoil its own beautiful theming. And get rid of the answer. No one will miss that. But just to wrap up, because I've gone on about technically 5 games already, if you count If at the start. Persona 3 is a great game, and I do love its story and characters. But I have such a bitter resentment to gameplay decisions that it has never allowed me to consider it like the best game in a series like so many others do. I actually feel it's the second worst. I think it's better than the original Persona by default, because the original Persona is so dated, and it's got an amazing story, but an amazing story alone is never enough to convince me to love a game. It just adds to a game I already love if the gameplay makes it. And Persona 3's gameplay does not make it when you're playing a game of luck far too often in its gameplay. Which luck is always a part of any JRPG game, especially turn-based, but it feels the most prevalent in 3 than any other JRPG I've ever played. I've played every single Megaton release that have released to the West. I've played every single Final Fantasy, except Lightning Returns. I've played the whole Neptunia series. I know enough of what I'm talking about when I say this. It is extremely luck-based, and it only hurts it. If you're going to play it, please, for the love of God, nowadays, if you can't get it cheap, try and get it on your PC. I don't recommend emulating, because, you know, technically it's illegal. But if you can emulate it, mod it so you can have control of your party, and then go through it that way. and you'll probably get a hell of a lot more out of it, and you might be able to get a better understanding of why so many people think it's the best game in the series. Because if it had that adjustment, if Tartarus just had more polish to it, because its aesthetic does get old, even if they change how it visually looks every so many floors as you advance a block, it still becomes extremely redundant, and the look and aesthetic of it blends into one another and becomes very non-existent by the time you get late in, especially near the end. Run in by questionable character developments with some parts of it as well, such as like Mitsuru's development feeling like it takes way too long to get going, and when it does it feels kind of rushed, because it's just like, oh no, my dad is dead, and then they spend the next day Yukari berating her, and then they get over it, and then they carry on. You're like, oh, alright, sure. And then the existence of the answer, which, to be fair, to wrap up that point I said, every Persona game has involvement of the shadow technically. Metis is Aigis' shadow, and Metis is in the answer, which is a shame that Metis is only tied to the answer, because I didn't mind the character. It's just she's tied to the worst piece of Persona content in the series, because it's literally just raw dungeon crawling, Tartarus 2.0, except of going up you're going down, which with more redundant floor designs. There's very little plot unless you finish each of the individual dungeons, and the overall story just directly harms really magical moments of the original story. So it's like, why would you bother? But I hope Metis can get some screen time. I'd love for them to throw in a future arena game. Like, go ahead, like, you've already got Labrys, like, give us Metis while you're at it. But I digress. But I've talked your ear off long enough. I've been going for an hour, and I need to get to work because I've got a lot of other things I need to do today, because tomorrow is the 5th anniversary of me doing Let's Plays, and I want to do something for that as well. So thank you so much for listening, but this is only part 1 of it because I've still got 2 more games to talk about. So that being said, I will see you then. Thank you for listening to my podcast kind of personal retrospective of why I love but don't love this franchise and where it stands. And next time when we talk about Persona 4 and 5, I will go into the community as well and where that stands. But until then, you guys take care now.